Do you have an issue with correlating your dry fire to live fire? You think things are happening in dry fire that aren't happening in live fire? Well, if so, this video is for you. What's up, guys? My name is Rob Epifania. I'm a USPSA Grandmaster and I'm the owner of Systematic Performance Concepts. In this video, we're going to talk about the rules of dry fire. How do we get the most out of what we're seeing in dry fire and allow it to apply into our live fire practice, into our matches? So, I came up with these rules as I was going through this. I was learning how to shoot an optic in the past year, and I had learned from training dry and then going live that sometimes what I'm seeing in dry fire, or more so what I'm accepting in dry fire, is not really correlating into better live fire performance. So what I came up with were several rules that we need to follow when we're dry firing in order to help improve our live fire results. Rule number one here is going to be that whenever we're calling shots, and I have another video about calling shots that we'll have filmed. It'll either be posted or it'll be posted soon. When we talk about calling shots in dry fire, we're mainly using either trigger break or trigger lift. I personally prefer trigger lift because it seems to time better with live fire, and it seems to time better in dry fire for me to get the results I want. But either one of those is acceptable as long as it's producing the results that you want. When we are calling shots, so when my trigger lifts, I'm calling wherever the dot was in that moment. I'm assuming that's where the shot is going to have happened. Now, we have to be careful with what we accept here, because there's a little bit of deviation in live fire. In live fire, if I see, for instance, the dot lift or my trigger lift happen about here on the corner of this AC zone, sometimes I'll get alphas. Sometimes I'll be on the better side of it. Sometimes I won't be. Sometimes I'll be on the worse side of it. So what I learned was that when you are scoring your targets in dry fire, you have to count any sort of edge hit as the lower value. So for instance, if this was on this Alpha Charlie line right here, we would count this as a Charlie. If this was on the Charlie Delta line here, we would count this as a Delta. If it were on the edge here, towards the edge of the delta here, I would assume that this is a miss for dry fire purposes. So when I'm trying to guarantee acceptable hits 100%, I have to take that into account. Now, let's say we have a partial target. This is an example of one sort of partial. The black represents hardcover, meaning nothing can penetrate it. If we touch the edge of this separation line here from the hardcover to the actual target, we're going to assume that our shot went in the black. And this is how I originally came up with this rule. Okay, when I was shooting a target similar to this live fire, I would call a shot in this edge area. Sometimes it would end up good, sometimes it would not. So this is why this rule is so important to live fire performance. Okay, now rule number two. Rule number two is any sort of paintbrush effect that the sights or the dot has needs to be counted for the lowest score within that effect. So what do I mean by that? When we're typically starting to shoot faster, we will start to accept more motion is happening, right? This dot or these sights may never be stable. And that's a good thing in terms of learning how to shoot sooner. As long as the sight or the dot is within the acceptable aiming area, we can fire the shot whenever we want. And the higher level you get, the more skill you gain, the less that's really fully stable. Okay? With that said, that was another thing I had to learn was anytime we have that paintbrush effect going, what I mean is something like this, right? Let's say we're seeing this and all of a sudden I'm about to press the trigger and I get something like this. Right, goes all the way out and back here. You have to assume the lowest value for that shot. In this case, it went all the way out to the delta. So I am going to assume that for dry fire, it is a delta. Now, in live fire, quite honestly, there's a good chance that if you see this entire motion, that there's a good chance that it'll probably end up in the Alpha or the Charlie. But for dry fire, that's not acceptable. Okay, so anytime we have that paintbrush effect, as we're pressing, going off trigger brake or trigger lift, if it's moving at that point way outside the zones, we have to take the lowest score there. That will help translate into better live fire performance. Okay, so rule number 1, edge hits always score lower. Rule number 2, paintbrush effect, it is anywhere within that area. Last rule is, then this is dependent on what you're doing. If you're doing more pushing speed, allowing your accuracy, so to speak, to suffer in the interest of gaining temporary speed so that you can now solve issues at a higher speed, this is one thing. But if you are going for execution, acceptable hits, let's say alphas and charlies in this case, you have to be able to 100% guarantee you have those hits before moving on to the next thing you're going to do. So tying in these two things, edge hits and paintbrush effect, we have to be able to guarantee we have at least alphas and charlies in our scoring when we're doing an execution style training, when we're trying to shoot to acceptable accuracy standards in dry fire. Okay, and you could obviously refine that to be more. You can only accept alphas. That's totally fine too. But as long as you can guarantee 100% that you had those hits, that's going to help you pay attention. If you're pushing speed, it's okay and it's expected to have hits that are not so great. But it's not acceptable to not be aware of it. You have to be aware of what's going on, because if you're not aware of what's going on, you will have a hard time trying to solve and correct for it. So applying all these rules together, and this goes for if you're training for speed, right? 100% guaranteed shots could be, I knew I had a miss on that target because I did X or Y. Let's say I didn't get to the target in time, or I pushed too hard and I went past it, or I had a bounce in my step. There are a lot of different things that can cause that, as long as you're aware of what might be happening, right? Not being aware of what's happening is not something we want to accept in most of our training. It does occasionally happen when we're starting to push ourselves, or we just happen to miss something. We're all human. We're not all 100%. But the closer we get to that 100% ability to guarantee what happened and not be surprised about anything that went wrong, the better off we're going to get. So, guys, recap. Edge hits score for lower. Paintbrush effect, anywhere within the target that paintbrush goes when the trigger is pressed, take the lowest score. And lastly, be able to guarantee and be aware of everything that's going on in your training. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to comment, share with others.